Judith, as I told you, as we agreed upon, I'm going to introduce you in Hebrew, and you're going to introduce yourself and choose whatever you want. Because whatever I'll say, it won't be enough, so you'll do it by yourself. אני אמרתי לפרופסור קוק שאני מציגה אותה בעברית, והיא תוסיף אחר כך באנגלית את כל מה שהיא מוצאת לנכון להציג. ופרופסור ג'ודי קוק היא מרצה לפסיכיאטריה ומנהלת המרכז לשירותי בריאות הנפש, מחקר ומדיניות במחלקה לפסיכיאטריה בבית ספר לרפואה באוניברסיטת אילינוי בשיקגו. היא נחשבת לסמכות בינלאומית בתחומים רבים, בין היתר בתחום שירותי בריאות הנפש תחום שירותי בריאות הנפש, ובין תחומי המחקר הרבים שלה זה שיקום פסיכיאטרי בקהילה, אנשים עם הבחנות כפולות, אנשים שיש להם גם מחלת נפש והם גם צורכים סמים, הערכת תוצאות או מה שנקרא גם מדדי תוצאה, והתערבויות מבוססות ראיות, ובנוסף גם היא מתמחה בתכנון מחדש של מערך שירותים, שזה אולי דבר חשוב ביותר שאנחנו יכולים להתמקד בו. והיא תיתן הרצאה על הגדרה עצמית בתהליך החלמה, והרצאה תתורגם לעברית על ידי תמר. תודה רבה. פרופסור ג'ודי קוק.
שאלה של בני עם פסיכיאטר.
אני הרבה זמן חשבתי שהוא כנראה.
אני חשבתי. אני גם חושב כתוב, יש הרבה שמאמרים על השם שלה.
זה התחושה שהתכנסו מהמאמרים.
המאמרים שלו ממש...
יכול להיות שגם הוא.
Welcome everyone. I'm very, very pleased to be here, and I would like to thank ISPRA for the invitation to attend and talk to you about some areas of psychiatric rehabilitation that I think will already be somewhat familiar to you, but also will stimulate you to think about your own work in this area, how you can improve it, and also, because I'm a researcher, I'm going to say a little bit about the importance of having research evidence in order to do the political advocacy that you are here in Israel in a perfect position to begin to do. I believe that psychiatric rehabilitation practitioners should count as one of their skills the kind of advocacy on behalf of the copers that they work with, also advocating with politicians and insurance companies to make sure people understand that psychiatric rehabilitation is one of the few things, some would say one of the only practices that helps people recover. And by recover, I mean more than stay out of the psychiatric hospital and have manageable symptoms. I'm referring instead to a life with dignity and pride, and a life that contributes to the good of the entire society. So let's talk a little bit about the notion of recovery and the fact that recovery, while it's obviously a positive goal for people, is also a process that involves risk-taking. And that as psychiatric rehabilitation practitioners, we focus a lot on the good things that happen when people recover, which is what we should be doing, but we don't always recognize the risks that people take when they step outside of the patient role, the role of someone who will always have a disability, who will never have a job, who will not live independently, who won't have a satisfying life, and say, no, that's not for me. I can do more, I can be more, I can contribute to my country, to my family, to my community. That involves taking some risks, and as psychiatric rehabilitation professionals, we have to think about what services and supports people need in order to take those risks. And one of the things that I think is helpful when we're thinking about this whole topic of risk-taking and its importance in recovery is to just think a little bit about the theories in psychology that address the notion of risk-taking and decision-making in uncertain situations. One thing I'd just like to familiarize everyone with is the notion of risk aversion. Risk aversion refers to the fact that some people, and this refers to people whether they have a psychiatric disability or not, this is a human trait that many of us have. With risk aversion, you have an individual who decides that they would rather strive for something that will have a goal that is not as good, but is a certain goal, than they would rather strive for something that is less certain, but would have a big payoff. So for many people, again, with or without psychiatric disabilities, they will often choose the known, even though it might result in a lesser life, a lesser status, a job with less money, but they can be sure that it will happen. Then they would choose to reach for something higher, something better, that is more risky, perhaps less likely to happen. So that's the concept of risk aversion. And do people grasp that pretty much? Does that make sense? Okay. And you also would recognize this has nothing to do with psychiatric disability per se, right? All right, this is something that many of you may be sitting there thinking, oh yeah, I'm a risk-averse person. Okay. And then the other concept that I want to talk about from the psychology of decision-making under risk and uncertainty is loss aversion. And this is just the notion that for some people, a loss, in fact, research shows that a loss has twice the emotional impact on many people than a gain does. And so some people will structure their decision-making, in fact, their entire lives, on avoiding having a loss occur versus trying to take a risk where they might gain something. Okay? Again, this is something that doesn't have anything specifically to do with mental illness, but when we think about the stigma that people with serious mental illness encounter in society, when we think about the fact that, let's face it, in the field of mental health, we don't have all the answers right now. We don't really even understand mental illness well. There are many debates about its cause and what its treatment should be. So many folks that have experienced psychiatric disability and may have a tendency toward risk aversion or loss aversion, as we all do, may then enter a system which is very much focused on giving people subtle messages, or even not so subtle messages. Don't take a risk. A loss would be much better, or excuse me, much worse than risking something that would be a gain. So this is just a little bit of psychological theory to think about and underlie some of the things that I'm going to be talking about today. Partly what I'm going to address is the notion of how we as psychiatric rehabilitation practitioners can make the risks of recovery more manageable for people, can support people in making the decision to take a risk, even if they're risk averse or loss averse. So we're helping that gentleman in the picture there make that big leap by providing supports, a safety net, let's say, that would help make that leap a leap to something that would be successful. The point here is that when people are making transitions, a transition to a job, a transition to their own apartment, a transition to a romantic relationship, maybe a marriage or to parenthood, to many of the things that, at least in the United States, were never thought to be reasonable goals for people with serious mental illness. Are we going to help a person through our psychiatric rehabilitation practice have an average life? Is that enough? Or are they going to have a memorable life? I think most of us would like to have a memorable life, and that's what we're working hard for. So how can we make that possible for the people we serve? And how can the copers in the room demand that psychiatric rehabilitation be the kind of service delivery that helps them have a memorable life? Not just a life out of the hospital, not just a life with that's not homeless or where there's not enough money, but a life that has dignity and progress. So I'm going to talk about some tools that could be used. Some of them you're familiar with. I hope you're all familiar with supported employment. You're psych rehabilitation practitioners, so I know you know about helping people go back to work. I'm going to talk about shared decision making, which I don't know is a concept that's as familiar to you. I'm going to talk about supported education and ask the question of whether we're at a university today, correct? How much support do people in Jerusalem who are recovering from serious mental illness have to come to this university and be successful here? Are there accommodations to help them enroll and succeed at a university like this? That's what supported education is all about. I'm going to talk about peer support and self-help. And I'm going to share my belief and many people's belief in the United States that what really helps psychiatric rehabilitation enter the mainstream is when peers demand it. When peers say medications and a group where we sit and talk about what we're going to do over the weekend or make arts and crafts is not enough. Right? We need to be able to enter the mainstream. We need to advocate for more than that. The combination of peers and psychiatric rehabilitation is what has made recovery a reality in the United States. Growing a peer movement is difficult and can be as difficult, probably more difficult for the peers than for the non-peers. And there are many soul-searching questions that come up when peers begin to run their own agencies, when they begin to share power in a true way. and when they begin to get funding from the government, just like professional providers do. But in the end, what has happened and can happen, certainly has happened in many countries, and I'm sure is beginning to happen here, is that the two movements come together and create a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. So I'll say a little bit more about that. And then finally, I'm going to talk about self-direction, which is the notion that people with any chronic illness, not just mental illness, but people with asthma, cancer, heart disease, can learn how to self-manage their wellness. This is a new concept in the field of mental illness, but it's a concept that's been around in the field of physical illness for a long period of time. And we have models, some of them taught by peers to other peers, that help self-direction occur. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Let's talk first about the notion of shared decision-making. Shared decision-making it's a joint process. It's shared by clients and providers. The clients play an active role. And by this I mean a truly active role. It's a 50-50 partnership when shared decision-making happens. But one of the aspects of shared decision-making that's so important is that the provider, the service provider, and the COPER together are trying to reach a decision that's based on evidence. Evidence is a major, major thing in the United States right now. We are, because we now are going to have national insurance, and we have a peer movement that's demanding to know whether many of the services that billions of dollars are being spent on are actually effective. We are spending a lot of time asking very hard questions about what works and what doesn't work. And in shared decision-making, being able to discuss what the evidence is for making one decision over another, trying one medication over another, trying one particular service over another. Should I consider a sheltered workshop, or should I consider a job that's in the mainstream, competitive employment? All is based on what's known in the evidence base. And also, part of shared decision-making is an open, honest discussion of the risks and benefits of all the available options for the person. Not a situation where the provider says, oh, he wants to go to this job and I'm nervous because it will be too stressful and he'll be back in the hospital again. And so I'm going to guide the discussion in such a way that he makes a decision that I feel will probably be best for him based on my experience, because I've had a lot of experience. I've seen a lot of people try to go to a competitive job and fail. Here in shared decision-making, the provider can say all that to the consumer. This is not about providers being silent and just listening to consumers, but there is sharing and an open discussion of the risks and the benefits of a decision. Because what often happens is the client turns around and says, those are the same fears that I have. I'm also worried that this will be too stressful. I'm also scared that I will fail. And out of that discussion and shared decision-making tends to come, according to the evidence, better decisions and decisions with more positive outcomes. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean here. First of all, you should recognize that research shows that everybody says they want to make shared decision-making in clinicians' work. All right? I mean, most clinicians don't say, you know, the reason I'm studying to help people is so that I can tell them what to do and make the decisions for them and subtly manipulate them to do what I know will be best for them, right? Nobody here is practicing in that way or studying to practice in that way or wants a service provider that's going to be that way. So many people want to do this, but it seldom happens. So we want to ask ourselves why that is, and we want to talk about some tools, some structured ways of making it happen. So what are the key elements of what I'm talking about, and how's it different than regular treatment planning? You all make treatment plans with your clients, right? You sit down together and talk about available services and goals that they have, and you help them match the services to their goals, correct? Right? Kind of? Yeah, okay. So this is a form of that, but it's done in a slightly different way, and you'll appreciate the difference when I've talked a little bit more about it. So clients' views about the types of service options or the goals they might want to have for their lives are valued, and they're seen as necessary, all right? But there's also the sharing of technical information, the evidence that I talked about, and making sure that clients understand that evidence. And sometimes it's being honest about the fact that there's not as much evidence as we'd like to have about what's the best way to go or whether a service is effective. But at least sharing what evidence exists so that people can make the most informed decisions as possible. And also that they can make their decisions based on the best available evidence. And as I said before, this is not a process where providers are silent. This is a process where providers share their recommendations, but also make sure that clients feel free to disagree, to have different recommendations, and also acknowledge the fact that if the client is not engaged in a shared decision-making process, goes along with what the service provider recommends, but isn't really invested in it, doesn't really feel comfortable with it, chances are it's going to fail. All right? That's really what the research shows us about decisions that aren't shared. But another thing that the provider does, the service provider does, is acknowledge the fact that there's uncertainty in the process, and that has, excuse me, an emotional context, but that both parties aren't exactly sure what will happen out of the decision. There are a number of tools that can be used for shared decision making. One of them is the Ottawa Personal Decision Guide. And by Ottawa, I'm referring to Ottawa, Canada. And we're going to say a little bit more about this in a moment. And the reason I'm going to spend so much time on this technique is because you can get it free on the internet. Okay? And anything that you can get free on the internet that has a research base and even has a training program, an online training program behind it, in the US at least, that's seen as very valuable. All right? The Ottawa I Should is a version of the Personal Decision Guide that occurs through Facebook. Okay, is Facebook popular here? Yes, okay. Do your younger clients in their 20s and 30s, are they on Facebook? Do they resonate with Facebook? Might they be more likely to use something that involves Facebook? Yeah, probably, okay. I'm not going to talk about the Facebook application because I am not in my 20s or 30s. I am not an enthusiastic Facebook user, but you can learn about this application also from the website that I'll refer to. I know that some of you have seen or at least heard of a woman named Pat Deegan, a service user from the United States who has created a shared decision-making tool called Common Ground. Is anybody familiar with Common Ground? If you'd raise your hand. Oh, a couple people have heard of it. Okay. This is a shared decision-making tool for patients and their psychiatrists to talk about what medication would be optimal for the person. And it's also a shared decision-making tool to talk honestly about not taking medication, which is something that strikes fear in the hearts of many psychiatrists. Not because they're bad people, not because they live to have people on medications, but because they've had many experiences of people who didn't take medications and had setbacks. And so, once again, this is a way that all of that can be discussed and processed as a person makes decisions about what kind of meds to take, whether they should try a different kind of medication, and whether they should take medications at all. And then there's a tool that you can get from my center for free, excuse me, called Raising Difficult Issues with Your Service Provider. That's quite a mouthful, isn't it? But it's a way that service users can bring up some things that can be very hard to say to service providers. And we actually designed this for use in psychiatric rehabilitation settings. Ways to say things like, you know, you ask me questions that are too nosy, too personal. I'd prefer not to talk about that. Or, you seem to be pushing me in one direction and I would rather go in another direction. It can be very difficult for some people to begin conversations with people about how they'd like to see their work in psychiatric rehabilitation change. And so this tool has a series of what we refer to as conversation starters, suggested ways that service users can bring up some of these more difficult things and begin a dialogue with providers, service providers, about particular issues. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the Ottawa Personal Decision Guide, and I'm going to actually walk you through what it would be like to use it. All right, so that, and also show you where you can get training to use it. So that you'll have a better sense of what I mean when I'm talking about shared decision making. So what this guide does is it helps people, first of all, identify what their options are. The person has to identify a decision they have to make. In a moment, you'll see me use the guide with someone that's trying to make the decision about whether they want to move out of the home that they're now sharing with their mother and father and either move to their own apartment or move to a hostel. Okay, so that's a pretty typical decision for some of your clients, right? And for those of you who are service users, this is maybe a decision that you faced if you lived with your folks for a while. It's a structured way of then listing the benefits and the risks for each of the options the person has, and also a way of identifying how they could choose the option with the most important benefits and the fewest risks. Because there could be many risks associated with a particular decision, but some are not as important as others. And that's one of the structured things that people learn from shared decision making. And then depending what stage of change the individual's in, and you're all familiar with the concept of stages of change, right? Okay, all right, good. You know, some people are in pre-contemplation, meaning I'm not even thinking about change right now. To many folks you work with, probably some of the most challenging folks for you, are they in pre-contemplation? And you sit there and you say, oh boy, you know, what am I going to do to help this individual because they're not ready to change, they're not ready to think about changing, and yet I'm supposed to be providing services to the individual. So you can do shared decision making even with people that are in the earlier stages of change. It's also a way to look at what is supporting or impeding the decision the person has to make. What is the person willing to try or not try? And specifically, how can you help as a service provider? And one of the things I want to point out about this, I'll show it to you in a minute, is that it's not only for a service recipient and a service provider. You could use this decision-making tool with family members. Two people that were trying to decide if they wanted to marry each other could use it. There are many ways in which you could use the tool, but it was developed out of a medical context. And it was developed to help people make difficult medical decisions. Things like deciding between a mastectomy or a lumpectomy. All right, or for men with high PSA levels, which could be an indicator of prostate cancer. Should they remove the prostate, which has a lot of negative side effects, or should they watch and wait? Okay, these are difficult decisions, right? And so this comes out of that literature and that research. So let's take a look at it. I'm sure you can all read that, right?
Oh, wow.
No. I'm actually showing you this slide because I'm showing you that this entire form fits onto one page. Okay, so it's not this big, long, complicated, multi-page thing that goes on and on and on that you as a provider, I'm sure you don't do enough paperwork in your job, so you'd love to have some more paperwork, right? So it's not more paperwork for you. It's also not intimidating for somebody that has a difficult decision to make. And now what I've done is I've just taken the form and put it into two pieces. I'm just going to walk you through it and show you how it works, and then I'm going to tell you where you can go online to get training on how to use it, because I'm not going to be able to do it justice in this presentation. So at the very beginning is something called clarify the decision, where the person just simply states, what's the decision you're trying to make? And in this case, this is somebody who says, moving out of my parents' house and into my own apartment or a hostel. And the next question is, when do you need to make a choice? This is a very important thing for people to understand. Decisions tend to seem like they're immediate and have to be done right away, but if you don't have to decide for a year, you can take a little bit of the anxiety away from the decision and do a little bit more research about it. And in this case, this individual decides they need to make a decision by the end of the calendar year. They're asked then to say, how far along are you with making a choice? You can start with someone that hasn't even thought about options, to someone that's thinking about options, someone that's just about to make their choice. Or you can use shared decision making with someone who has already made a choice. And I think this is very, very important as a way of working with someone who's making a choice that you're not comfortable with as a service provider. Not to get them to change their mind, all right? But perhaps for you to understand a little better what's motivating them to do what they want to do. And also a way for you to share how you're feeling about that decision with the individual. So in this case, this individual is just thinking about options right now. The next question is, are you leaning toward one option or another? And in this case, the person has checked no. So there is no real person. This is my rich fantasy life here in writing this form and trying to make it interesting. So next you're going to explore the decision. You're going to list the options and the main benefits and risks that are already clear to you if you're the person making the decision or the service provider. You're going to underline the benefits and risks that you think are most likely to happen. I couldn't get the underline function to work on the form, so I didn't do that part. And then you're going to use stars to show how much each benefit and risk matters to the individual. But what you're basically doing is you're taking this decision and breaking it down into some structured steps. But some structured steps that the research shows are helpful for people that are trying to make decisions. So the first option is to move to an apartment with 2 friends. All right? That's what this person is thinking about doing. What are some benefits to that option? One benefit is my friends really want me to join them in living in the apartment, and that's exciting and good for me. Another benefit to this decision is that it's a regular apartment. There's no rules related to mental illness. All right? As you know, in agency-sponsored housing that's run by mental health agencies, there's often a lot of rules. You have to have a roommate because that's the way our house is structured. No one can have sex because, I don't know why because, but because. You can't have food in your room. You can't have a pet. There's lots of rules that go with residential living. And there would be none of that if I moved in with my 2 friends. And then the last benefit would be I could bring my cat. Okay, another very important thing for many folks. But what are some risks associated with moving into an apartment with my 2 friends? I'd have to split the costs 3 ways, all right? And that's going to be expensive. They might not be sympathetic, all right? They've seen me and they're friends of mine, but they haven't necessarily seen me when I've had some symptoms. They haven't seen me in my times when I'm, not at my best. And so I don't know what it'll be like to live with them. I've never lived with people other than my parents. And I might not fit in. All right, we can assume here these are two friends that aren't copers, and they have their own friends. Their friends might not like me. It might be difficult. And you can see the person has given different stars to indicate how important those benefits and risks are. Option number 2, move to a hostel for people with mental illness. What are the benefits? Well, it would be subsidized. The government would pay for part of it, so it would be cheaper. And secondly, they'll understand my challenges. All right, they'll know, because it's a hostel for people with mental illness, that sometimes I'll have symptoms. What are some risks? Well, there's lots of rules and policies to follow in the hostel. I'll have to have a roommate, because that's the way this hostel is structured. I can't bring my cat with me, because this hostel has a rule that you can't bring pets. And then here's the last option, which is to stay with my parents, which is still a viable option. All right? And again, you want to understand what are the benefits and risks there. Well, one big benefit is it's less risky financially. In the scenario I've come up with, the parents are not charging their son or daughter to live there. Less emotional hassle. All right? I won't have to break away from them. I won't have to tell them I'm moving. I won't have to deal with their fears and concerns that I might not be able to make this move successful, which is certainly something that a lot of families would worry about. And finally, my cat is part of the family where I live. All right? There's absolutely no question that I can keep my cat if I stay at home with my folks. What are some risks if I stay there? Never being independent. If I never move out, I may never be independent. That's a risk. And here's one that I think doesn't get talked about enough or a lot, and that's what happens when they die. If I only ever live with my parents for the rest of my life, what does that mean if they're not there at the end of my life? And this, by the way, is not something that only copers worry about. This is something that many, many families worry about as well. Getting all this out in the open with a service provider, even filling this out with your family, is a way to surface some issues and get some things on the table to talk about. So which option do you prefer at this point as you're helping the person work through this form? And generally you're not going to sit down and say, okay, we're going to fill out this form in the next hour. All right? Maybe you're going to get the form out and you're going to explain the whole form, let the person take it home, think about it a little bit, and the next time you get together, maybe you'll fill out the beginning few questions. But the option the person thinks they prefer after they've worked through all of this is number 1, moving to an apartment. Next, you move down to the section where you talk about supporters. Who else is involved is the question that gets asked. And the person identifies, well, my parents are involved, my friends are involved, and my case manager is involved. Do you use the word case manager here? Okay, all right. And by case manager, what I mean is a person who's kind of the advocate for the individual. It's not a traditional clinical relationship, across the desk, but one more like what I would think of as psychiatric rehabilitation. For each of those people, the individual is asked to think about, well, which option does this person want me to take? And also, is this person pressuring you? And finally, how can this person support you? All right, so let's start with my parents. The option that this person thinks their parents prefer is that he or she stay with them. Okay? If you were working through this with your parents, you might be surprised to have your parents say, well, actually, we're okay if you move out. Or we're worried about this and concerned, but we'd support this. So, at any rate, this is the individual's perception of what their parents want, which is to stay with them. The individual feels pressured by the parents. They've checked yes for that. And this person or persons can support me by letting me decide for myself. Okay, so that's all gotten out in the discussion. My friends, which option do they prefer? Well, obviously they want me to move in with them. Are they pressuring you? No. And how can this person support you? And the answer there is they're already being supportive. And finally, my case manager. All right. Which option does this person prefer? I don't know. That's kind of nice to hear if you're a case manager, because it shows that in the individual's eyes, you're an objective person. You don't have a preconceived idea of what they should do about their decision. Are they pressuring you? No. Another thing you'd like to hear if you're a case manager. And finally, how can this person support you? They can help me think about options. And then you move into a decision about what role do you prefer in making your choice. And here you might be surprised to hear that one of the things the person can check is, I prefer that someone else decides. Okay? That's perfectly okay in shared decision making. But what you want to have done is worked through the first part of this exercise. So the individual is making this decision, you decide, I don't want to decide, based on having thought through all of those things. Not starting with the idea of, I don't know what to do, tell me what to do, you make the decision. In this case, the person wants to share the decision with their friends and with their case manager. Then you go on to look at what are the decision-making needs for the individual. First question that's asked is, do you know the benefits and risks of each option? And you might be surprised to see that the person has checked no. And further down in the form, you'll see that what they're missing is information, financial information. Okay, what's going to happen if this occurs or that occurs? So they need information designed to help them make that decision. Are they clear about which benefits and risks matter to them? They checked yes there because they've worked through the benefits and risks exercise. Do you have enough support and advice to make a choice? There they've checked no, indicating that they need more support and advice. And then, do you feel sure about what's the best choice for you? And there they've checked no as well. And then in the bottom of the form is an opportunity to walk through with the individual what they need in the way of knowledge, what they need in the way of values clarification, what support would be helpful to them in making the decision, and if they're feeling pressure from other people, what you can do or what they can do to deal with that pressure. And then at the very bottom, there's an opportunity to talk about other plans. So I'm not going to read through the whole form with you. I'm assuming you'll all have access to this presentation on PowerPoint. If not, I can send it to you or make it available on my website. But this is an example of the process that you would use then to work through an important decision with an individual and to truly share it and to share how you feel about the decision as a provider, as well as hear how they feel about the decision as the person who's ultimately going to make the decision and live with the consequences. What's nice, as I've said about this structured way of decision making, is that there's a whole tutorial that you can take online that's much more detailed than what I've just given you for how to use it and how to work through it. And if you're a service user out there, if you're a coper out there who says, I love this tool, but I actually want to fill it out myself, there's ways and instructions to fill it out on your own. So that's an example of what I mean about shared decision making. It's a little different maybe than the way you've been taught to help people that are facing decisions, or is this something you knew already and I just reviewed all the skills that you have? No? Is it new? Somewhat new? Hopefully. Hopefully a little bit new. And so this is a quote from an author from a long time ago in the United States that says, why not go out on a limb? Isn't that where the fruit is? All right, this notion that you have to take risks in order to get a maximal payoff. So that's our tool number one, shared decision making. Now I'm going to talk about a second tool called financial literacy, which stems from the idea, at least in the United States, that the way we have looked at the financial futures of people in recovery as going from being dependent on their families, on disability payments. People with psychiatric disabilities in Israel can get public disability payments, right? Okay. If they are like they are in the United States, they're set at below the poverty level, right? All right, they're not rich. It's not great to live on public disability. The rationale, the political rationale for that is if we gave people with disabilities a decent amount of money to live on, they'd all want that money and they wouldn't work. All right, so that's the political rationale for setting disability payments below the poverty level. So in the US, we sort of assumed, well, people will live in poverty while they're young, and then when they get old enough to move on to our public system for people who are older, they'll live in poverty while they're old. Okay? Not exactly an empowering message for a person who's in recovery, trying to recover a life with dignity and meaning. So part of what we're missing here in our work as psychiatric rehabilitationists is teaching people financial literacy. First of all, so that they can make better decisions with the little bit of money they have. And then secondly, as they begin to recover, as they get their first job, as they have to make decisions about, can I afford to live in an apartment or not, they are empowered and understand their own financial situation well enough so that that's not one of those unknowns or fears that they have. Now, one of the problems with financial literacy is that the general population, at least in the United States, is pretty financially illiterate. Okay? And I don't know, were you all taught financial literacy in school? No. Do you all have budgets that you follow? No. Some of you do. Some of you do. Financial literacy, let's say financial illiteracy, is another one of those things that people with psychiatric disabilities share with the rest of the population. Okay? And it's also a thing that we have found at my center that many psychiatric rehabilitation practitioners find boring or threatening or just difficult to grasp. But what we found is that it can make the world of difference in outcomes for people in the recovery process. And so I'm presenting it as a second tool that can be used to help people recover and help have a memorable life. So just want to say that by financial literacy, we're simply talking about helping people understand money, how to manage their own personal finances, and also engage in personal financial planning. Now, why haven't we done this up till now? Well, many people with psychiatric disabilities and the folks that work with them feel that it's futile to engage in financial planning with poor people because the thought is, well, they don't have enough money anyway, so what are we going to help them plan? Okay, so here's a quote. We've done a lot of work on this at my center, and one of the things we did was an interview study where we talked to people about how they felt about their finances and living in poverty and whether they are interested in financial planning. And so this woman says, I just sat down the other day and wrote out checks to pay my bills and find out I've already spent my money just by paying my bills. There was no fat to trim, nothing left to budget. Well, it turns out that there often is some fat to trim. There are things left to budget. The question is, what's important to the individual? What do they want to save money for? I mean, if somebody's not interested in financial literacy, forget it. Consider that they're in pre-contemplation and raise it occasionally. Use the techniques like consciousness raising that you're supposed to use as psych rehab practitioners with people that are in pre-contemplation. But many people in our research, we've found, are spending their money on things that we can help them figure out another way to meet those goals. For example, do you have Starbucks here? No. You know what I mean by Starbucks, right? And I know I've had some great coffee, so you must have Starbucks-like businesses here, right? Okay. Are you familiar with the idea of paying $5 American for a latte? Yes. Okay. All right. Well, so are many mental health consumers, all right? And helping an individual figure out what they would save if they were to stop buying their lattes at whatever the name of it is here in Israel and get a good Melita dripper and filters and get some good ground coffee and get a thermos that they could take their coffee to work with or to their program with or whatever they're doing, and still have money left over to do whatever it is that's important to them. And I think this is the key thing with financial literacy, is that you need to figure out what it is the individual wants from having a budget, from being more literate. Is it a goal that they want to move to their own apartment? Is it that they want to buy a dress for their sister's wedding? Is it that they want to get a pet but can't afford dog food? All right? It's the goal that will lead to the desire to become financially literate. Also, many people have a very fatalistic view of financial planning, especially people who are depressed and poor people who really feel that the minute they have some money in their hands, they should go ahead and spend it. Right? This is a very common feeling among poor people. It has nothing to do with mental illness. It's actually a common thing. So we developed a financial education curriculum working together with COPERS that would help individuals begin to understand their financing, develop a goal that they wanted to save for, come to believe that even though they were living in poverty, there is almost always some fat to trim and a way to save some money if the goal is important and meaningful enough. So our course, which you can get for free, but unfortunately is only in English, but perhaps someone out there who's turned on by this idea will translate it into Hebrew and will help you, starts first of all by helping individuals understand what's important to them, what their values are around money, needs versus wants. Okay, you need to eat dinner. You want a hamburger from McDonald's. Okay, all right, that's a difference, needs versus wants. Many people don't think about that. Identifying financial goals and budgeting. In each segment of this 6-session class, people budget in different ways. Budgeting is boring, everyone hates budgeting, so we use a variety of different ways. We use envelope budgeting, we use keep every receipt for a week budgeting, we use an online free budgeting application that people can get. But the whole idea is to gently work people into tracking what money is coming in and what money is going out. And let me tell you, this goes a lot easier if people are doing it in a group, if they're sharing their frustrations, and if there's pizza or something fun to eat, and there's a way to make it an interesting experience, not just boring, dull budgeting. We talk about understanding then income and expenses and developing a savings plan. We talk about managing debt. Many mental health consumers in the United States are in drastic debt due to credit cards, due to what we call predatory lenders, people who will cash a check for an individual but then keep 30% of the amount. Do you have these kinds of things that happen here? Okay, all right. I mean, I know case managers that are working with people that have never worked in their lives but were able to get credit cards and come to them $10,000 or $15,000 in debt. And that, of course, is a major barrier to people's ability to recover. And so working your way out of debt is something that gets talked about. Understanding credit cards is another segment of this course. Using financial institutions. In the United States, if you don't have a bank account, there's nowhere to cash your checks. There's nowhere to build up a credit history. In fact, there's a whole concept in the field of poverty studies in the United States that refers to the unbanked, people that don't use banking institutions, and all the disadvantages that they encounter. They can't pay their bills online. They can't have direct deposit. All right? All of these things are disadvantages that are faced by the unbanked. And then finally, building savvy consumer skills, figuring out how to avoid all the different traps that are out there for low-income people. So this is an example of financial education that's been incorporated into many psychiatric rehabilitation programs and is actually now quite popular in the United States. And I'll tell you, the group that has adopted this with the most enthusiasm are our peer-run centers in the U.S. We have many programs in the U.S. called consumer-operated programs. These are programs that are run by and for people in recovery. I know you have some of that here, maybe not as much of it as we have. And this curriculum is designed that it can be taught. You don't have to be an expert in financial planning to teach this curriculum. And that is a group of individuals who truly do understand the need for financial literacy as a part of recovery. So that's tool number 2. And this is a quote from one of our poets talking about walking in the woods and coming to a road that goes one way or the other, and is relevant to this notion of, am I just going to live in poverty and not think much about my finances, or am I going to learn more about them and think about the fact that I don't want to be poor all of my life? Okay, the next tool, tool number 3, is supported employment. And I'd just like to know, because I know many of you are from psychiatric rehabilitation programs, how many of you are from programs that provide, if not supported employment, some types of employment services to clients? Would you raise your hands? Okay, that's great. That's great. And you're familiar with the concept of supported employment? Or not so much? Okay. Okay, good. So there's been a lot of research on supported employment in the United States. In fact, it is classified as an evidence-based practice by our federal government. And it took many, many years and a lot of research to even convince people that folks with psychiatric disabilities could work in places other than sheltered workshops, and needed services designed to help them go to work. But what works the best, at least in the United States economy, is a model that's designed like this. First of all, you don't have the vocational service providers here and the clinical service providers there. That does not work. They need to be in constant contact with each other. If someone's having symptoms on the job, the psychiatrist needs to be available to make changes and help the individual. This usually happens then through multidisciplinary teams that involve psychiatrists, social workers, benefits counselors, which are people help people understand their benefits, and peer supporters who are all working together to help the individual get a job and keep a job. Another feature of supported employment is on rapid job search and placement. We used to have a model in the United States called transitional employment, where people went through extended periods of assessment, 6, 8 months. What if you went somewhere and said, I want to be trained for a job, and we took 6 or 8 months to assess you and see what your work skills were like? You'd be out of there, right? You would say, I'm not excited about being in this program. So in supported employment, the idea is that you help people enter the workforce as soon as possible, not before they're ready. You're not pushing them out into the job. But the focus is on place and train, meaning place the person in the job, train them afterward, versus having an extended period of training and then placement. The focus in supported employment is on competitive employment, a job that anyone could hold. All right? Also on a job that meets the preferences of the person that is the worker. Part of transitional employment in psychiatric rehabilitation in the United States was a series of generic jobs that didn't really belong to the person. And we would say to them, well, take this job for a little while to get some work history, and we'll observe you to see if you're doing well. And then we'll move you to a job that's more demanding and pays more money. And then if you do well at that, we'll move you to a third job that's also more demanding and pays more money. Is anyone familiar with the 3 most stressful life changes for individuals? You familiar with this research? Okay, one is the death of a family member. The second is changing your residence, moving from one place to another. You want to know what the 3rd most stressful thing is for people changing their job. Okay? So, controversial, right? I mean, the field of psych rehab was very proud of transitional employment for many, many years. The research showed it never really led to a permanent job that was a job that could help you recover. It led to a series of sequential jobs, and then generally, if the individual wasn't involved with the program anymore, back to unemployment. So that's why the focus on competitive employment. And finally, supported employment is the notion of a job with no time limits. And I may have exceeded my time limit, and I've got 10 minutes. Okay. So that's our model of supported employment. I would say that it's a lot easier to describe as a model than it is to make happen. Is anybody here from a supported employment program? Okay. And do you follow this model? No. Okay. And most supported employment programs aren't able to make all of this happen. So the question then is how to get as close as you can to the principles of supported employment, while also dealing with the realities of the system that you're in, which might be high unemployment, which might be stigma at the workplace, which might be people's fear of making too much money because it might threaten their disability benefits. All right? But this is the model that in a variety of contexts all over the world works, also in areas where with high and low unemployment, and also outside the United States. Although I haven't yet seen research on supported employment from Israel, but I would love to see that research, because I think that would go a long way toward helping people think a little bit more about increasing vocational services. This is a document that I'm not going to spend much time talking about, but it is a document for copers that helps them learn about what supported employment is and how to identify whether the vocational program they're thinking of joining provides supported employment services versus other kinds of services that are less effective. And basically, they learn about the program and answer a series of questions, and then they add up their score to determine whether or not this is a program that has the elements of supported employment in it. All right? And you can get that also free from our website. I know you have supported employment here because, at least on this website of Enosh, I see pictures of people working in supported employment positions. And maybe you even see some people that you know in some of these pictures. All right. Supported education. All right, this is the fourth tool that is necessary for folks. Supported education is a service often delivered at psychiatric rehabilitation programs that helps people enter post-secondary education of any kind. It might be vocational training, it might be university education, and in some cases it helps people finish their final degree that you get. We call it a high school degree. I don't know what you call it. Without at least a high school degree, which in the United States is 12 years of education, it's very difficult to get any kind of job. And some folks have had their educational careers interrupted. Why is supported education such a good idea? Well, many folks have had to drop out of education because of when they first developed serious mental health problems. As I just mentioned, many good jobs are not possible to obtain without a certain educational level. And without adequate education, our vocational efforts to help people enter the workplace pretty much doom them to entry-level jobs. So those are three important areas of supported education. Is this a model that some of you are already familiar with? Good. So you know that some of the elements are things like helping people enroll in college, helping them figure out where to get the money, scholarships in order to attend college, going with them if necessary and if desired to help them visit campuses to see where they might like to go, help them choose courses, help them study. One of the most stressful times for students can be during midterms and final exams. I'm not talking about students with mental illness here. I'm talking about everybody. So being available for support on campus during those times is another service. Linkage to student counseling and other types of services. The research shows not only do these services help people enter and succeed in college and vocational classes, but also results in them getting better jobs. So there's plenty of evidence that this is effective. And there's also evidence in your own country in research conducted by these individuals who engaged in a supported education program in 8 cities in Israel with folks with schizophrenia. So I would encourage you to take a look at that research and to think about if you can't implement an entire supported education program at your agency, whether you can add some things like some tutoring or some help with people deciding whether or not to go to college or which college to go to. The idea here is that helping people take the first step is what's important in supported education, as well as other pathways to recovery. I want to say a little bit more about peer support and self-help. I know that in some ways it's at some of its beginning stages. I know the government does not fund peer-run programs here, correct? They do somewhat? Okay. They don't. Okay. Now in the United States, peers can be funded by the government in the same way that other service providers. Are they funded at the same level? No. All right. But they have independent sources of funding. Why peer programs? Because peers know better, really than anyone, about this whole risk-taking phenomenon. And they also often have good skills and knowledge to impart about how to deal with these risks, and can often come together to help people manage risks. So that is another area, another tool that hopefully, one of the reasons peer support and peer-run programs grew in the United States was because psychiatric rehabilitation programs nurtured those peer-run programs, gave them their start, let them meet at the facility where the psych rehab program was. And finally, we're going to say a little bit about self-direction. The notion that people can manage their own wellness and manage their own symptoms. I don't mean in the absence of medication or in the absence of psych rehab, but that basically self-management of illness is a concept that applies to any long-term mental illness, and that mental illness is really not that different than physical illness. Is anyone here familiar with WRAP, Wellness Recovery Action Planning? You are? Okay, great. I looked all through the internet and could find no information, probably because it was in Hebrew. I finally learned the night before I came here how to use Google Translator. And I learned that what I had to do was translate it into Hebrew and put it in Hebrew. So is anyone here running WRAP groups? No? Okay, so you've heard about it, but you're not doing it yet. Okay. IMR, but it's a little bit different, okay? But it's the same concept of learning how to manage your own illness. WRAP is a class that was developed by a group of consumers in the United States. It's very, very popular now, and it lasts for about 8 sessions. It's highly structured, and the individual develops a wellness toolbox of simple, inexpensive strategies that they can use to help them stay well. They identify supporters in their lives that will help them when things are breaking down. WRAP doesn't use terminology like symptoms or crisis. And it turns out to be a very effective way, not only for people to learn to manage their own illnesses and self-direct their recovery, but also a thing that in peer-run programs, peers can teach each other. And because of time limitations, maybe I can talk to some of you at the break. about the different things that people learn when they go through wellness recovery action planning. But I pretty much described it to you in what I just talked about. But here's some research that we just finished about RAP's effects on individuals in recovery. It reduces their psychiatric symptom severity, lowers their feelings of depression and anxiety, increases their hopefulness for their recovery. It decreases their tendency to cope by blaming themselves, which is a very common phenomenon. It increases their quality of life. It helps them learn to advocate for themselves, stand up for themselves. It increases their sense of recovery, as well as their sense of empowerment. And that's a series of research studies, a randomized controlled trial that I just finished at my center, which is really changing the way in the United States that people are thinking about peer-to-peer services, because now there's an evidence base for a peer-to-peer service. Yes, you do have IMR in Israel, and yes, there has been research. And yes, it was a randomized control trial, and it was found to be quite effective. IMR has pretty much the same principles, but is not taught by peers to other peers. Okay? Both models have a strong evidence base. I believe there's room for both models to exist. But peers are the teachers of RAP, and that's why I brought that one up. Okay, so it's an evidence-based practice in the United States. I want to leave you with a closing thought by Helen Keller. So much of my presentation is based on U.S. culture. Does anyone know who Helen Keller is? You all know, okay, all right. So if there ever was an individual who might be risk averse, who might not want to make a loss, I think that her comment about security is very, very interesting. She says it's mostly a superstition. It really doesn't exist in nature. People really aren't secure. Not really. Anything can happen at any moment to take away people's security. And that avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than exposing yourself to risks. The point is, however, that we're not talking about risk that's foolhardy, not talking about risk where there's not support, where there's not a genuine alliance between the coper and the service provider. Psychiatric rehabilitation is in the best position to help people take risks that lead to recovery. I hope I've caused all of you to think about that a little bit and bring it to your work. Thank you all very, very much.